I was the new driver on the Route 17 night shift. The old driver, Mr. Karanja, had quit suddenly. No warning, no goodbye. Just left his uniform and the bus keys at the station. People said he had gone back to his village, but no one really knew why. I should have asked more questions. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. Mr. Karanja had been driving this route for almost 20 years. He was a quiet man, the kind who never complained and never took a sick day. But in the weeks before he left, people said he had changed. He had grown thinner, his eyes sunken. He started mumbling to himself, refusing to make eye contact. One night he arrived at the station with his hands shaking so badly that he dropped his keys. That was the last time anyone saw him. Some of the older station workers said he had warned them. "This bus is cursed," he had whispered. "They aren't real. They never were." No one had taken him seriously. Maybe I should have. I took the job because I had no choice. I had been unemployed for months and my bills were piling up. The night shift paid better, and I told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had nowhere else to go. I had burned too many bridges, made too many mistakes. I had left my hometown after falling out with my family, drifting from job to job, never staying in one place for too long. Driving the night bus felt like a fresh start. No customers to complain, no supervisors breathing down my neck. Just me, the road, and the dark. Yeah, I thought I had finally found some peace. I was wrong. The first few nights were normal. The route was long, cutting through small villages and empty roads. We left the city at 10 p.m. and reached the last stop at 3 a.m. I picked up the usual late-night workers, a few drunks, and some people traveling far. Nothing strange, until the night of the first disappearance. It started with a woman in a blue headscarf. I remember her because she was the last person I picked up before we left the village of Kambi. She paid in cash, sat in the middle row, and kept her eyes on the window. She didn't speak to anyone. An hour later, I glanced in the mirror. She was still there. 5 minutes passed. I glanced again. She was gone. I slammed the brakes. The bus shuddered to a stop. I jumped up, scanning the seats. No sign of her. No luggage left behind. No sound, no trace. I checked the aisle, even under the seats, nothing. My skin prickled. I was sure she had been there. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was an old man. He got on at the same village, sat near the front. He had a limp. I remember because I waited an extra few seconds for him to climb the steps. We even exchanged a few words. "Cold night," he muttered as he settled into his seat. "Yes, it is," I replied, forcing a smile. Halfway through the trip, I checked the mirror. He was staring out the window, his hands resting on his cane. 10 minutes later, I glanced again. His seat was empty. I turned around so fast I nearly lost control of the wheel. My heart pounded as I pulled over and rushed to check. I walked up and down the aisle. I called out. Silence. The doors were locked. The windows shut tight. There was no way he could have left. My fingers trembled as I gripped the wheel. I told myself I was imagining things, that I must have missed something, but deep down, I knew better. Night after night, people kept disappearing. A young boy with a red backpack, a pregnant woman, a man in a white suit, all from the same village, all sitting quietly, all gone before the end of the trip. I stopped sleeping properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Blank, silent, watching. I started asking questions. I talked to the station workers, the villagers, anyone who might know something. Nobody wanted to answer. When I mentioned Canby Village, people shut their doors. One old woman whispered, "You should leave that job before it takes you too." It was the way she said it, "takes you," that made my skin crawl. That's when I found Kamau. Kamau had been a driver once, just like me. He had driven Route 17 long before Mr. Karanja. I found him at a rundown bar near the station, nursing a glass of warm beer. His eyes were dark, filled with something deeper than exhaustion. "You're the new guy, aren't you?" he muttered before I could even introduce myself. I nodded. "You used to drive this route?" He let out a hollow chuckle. "Used to." He took a slow sip, then leaned in. "You've seen them, haven't you?" I hesitated. "The passengers?" He nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass. "They aren't passengers." "Not anymore." I swallowed hard. What are they?" Kamau stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "They were lost a long time ago, before the road was built, before the villages, before everything." He exhaled sharply, "And now they're looking for someone to take their place." I shivered. "How do I stop it?" "You don't." Kamau leaned back. "You just pray they don't choose you." Kamau's words lingered in my mind long after I left the bar. You just pray they don't choose you. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. The silent passengers, their vacant stares, and the way they disappeared without a trace. Had I imagined it all, or was I just another exhausted driver losing his mind? The next evening, I reported for my shift as usual. The bus felt different, heavier. The air inside was thick, stagnant, as if it had been trapped for years. When I adjusted the rearview mirror, a chill ran down my spine. The seats were empty, just as they should be. Yet I could feel eyes on me. At the first stop, an old woman climbed aboard. I barely glanced at her as she shuffled to a seat near the back. Then at the next stop, a young man in a suit stepped in. Stop after stop, more boarded. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the bus was full. I exhaled in relief. See? Normal passengers, normal route. Then I glanced at the fare box. It was empty. My breath hitched. I turned, heart pounding. The passengers sat in eerie silence, their gazes locked forward, unblinking. Not a single one had paid. My hands tightened around the wheel. I kept driving, unwilling to look again. But then, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, I noticed something. The old woman from the first stop. She was gone. Her seat was empty. I hadn't stopped. Well, I hadn't opened the doors. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. Then the young man in the suit, he was gone too. Seat by seat, one by one, they were disappearing. And then in the mirror, I saw something worse. The empty seats weren't just empty. They were filled with shadows, faint impressions of figures that weren't there. Shapes shifting, waiting for me. A cold sweat dripped down my temple. I pressed my foot on the accelerator. I didn't care about the route anymore. I didn't care about the rules. I just needed to get off this bus before they took me too. The next night, I drove with so much fear. When I reached Canby, I hesitated. The bus idled at the stop, doors open, waiting. For the first time, I didn't want to pick up the passengers, but they climbed on anyway. Then came the night I tried to stop it. I picked up a young woman with tired eyes. She sat near the front, rubbing her arms as if she was cold. I kept glancing at her, determined to prove to myself that she wouldn't vanish. 30 minutes in, I saw her reflection in the mirror. Her face was blurred, her body faint like mist. I slammed the brakes and rushed towards her. She looked up at me, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. "Stay with me," I begged. "Don't go." Her eyes were sad. She lifted a hand, fingers brushing mine, and then she faded. Right before my eyes, she disappeared like smoke in the wind. I screamed. I decided to quit. But before I did, I had to see for myself. I needed proof. I brought my phone and set it up to record the bus all night. That night, I picked up my usual passengers, a man with a cane, a woman in a green dress, a teenage girl chewing gum. I checked the mirror every 5 minutes. They were there. Then they weren't. I pulled over, grabbed my phone, and watched the footage. I almost dropped it. The passengers didn't vanish. They faded. Slowly, like mist. Their bodies blurred, shimmered, then disappeared completely. No sound, no movement, just gone. I felt something behind me. The bus engine hummed. The lights flickered, whisper. I turned. The seats were full again. Faces stared back at me. The woman in the blue headscarf. The old man with the limp. The boy with the red backpack. They weren't passengers anymore. They were waiting for me. I could not move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel. My breath short and ragged. The whispering grew louder. I felt the air around me grow heavy, as if unseen eyes pressed against my skin. I slammed the bus into gear and sped down the empty road. My mind screamed at me to stop, to jump out, but something kept me glued to my seat. The mirrors, the reflections, they were wrong. The passengers, the ones who had faded, they were sitting stiffly, their heads slowly turning towards me, their faces eerily still. I gripped the wheel tighter. "This isn't real. This isn't real," I muttered. The lights ahead flickered. The road bent sharply to the left, but the bus kept going straight. The engine whined, resisting my command. I yanked the wheel. The bus groaned, skidding onto the dirt road beside the highway, shaking violently as it hit uneven ground. Then, silence. The bus had stopped. The road ahead was gone. In its place was a dark forest, thick and impenetrable. The village of Canby lay ahead, but it was no longer a village. It was ruins, ancient, broken, lifeless. I swallowed hard. The whispers had stopped. The air had changed. I turned back to look at the seats. Empty. I gasped, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. Where had they gone? I had seen them just a second ago. I fumbled with my phone, shaking hands pulling up the footage. My fingers were slick with sweat. I pressed play. This time, the video showed something new. As the passengers faded, dark shadows remained. They were not leaving. They were shifting, moving, taking shape. They weren't passengers anymore. They were something else. And they were looking at me. The phone flickered and died. A cold hand touched my shoulder. I screamed. My world spun. The bus, the road, the trees, it all faded into darkness. When I woke up, I was in my apartment. My bed, my room, my things all in place as if nothing had happened. But something was different. The bus keys lay on my nightstand. And outside my window, parked under the streetlight, was the empty bus. I tried to run. I packed my things and got on the first bus out of town. But when I stepped off, I was right back where I started. The same street, the same apartment, the same bus waiting under the streetlight. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. My phone wouldn't turn on. My calls wouldn't go through. Then last night I heard it. The engine, running, a voice whispered from inside. "It's your turn." And I knew. I could run, I could hide, but the bus would always find me. 'Cause once you drive the vanishing bus, you never really leave. You just wait for the next driver. I took a deep breath and grabbed the keys. I knew it was pointless to resist. My hands trembled as I walked to the bus, stepping inside. The door hissed shut behind me with a finality that sent a shudder down my spine. The dashboard lights flickered to life, but I hadn't turned the ignition. The route was set. The wheels shifted under my fingers, moving as if guided by unseen hands. My foot pressed the pedal, but it wasn't me doing it. I wasn't driving anymore. I was being driven. The bus lurched forward, rolling onto the empty road. My breath came shallow and fast. I tried to lift my hands from the wheel, but they were locked in place. The rear-view mirror showed rows of empty seats, silent, waiting. But as I stared, shadows began to form. Vague outlines, the faintest suggestion of figures watching me. My vision blurred. My limbs felt heavy, as if something was seeping into my skin, pulling me under. I wasn't just losing control, I was fading. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, but it was changing. The familiar streetlights flickered and winked out, one by one. The tarmac cracked and peeled away, revealing something older beneath. Stone, dust, a path that had no right to exist in the modern world. I blinked. The bus wasn't on a road anymore. It was gliding through a vast, empty expanse. The sky above was wrong. Too deep, too endless, too full of things I couldn't comprehend. The air inside the bus grew thick, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. Then I heard it, a whisper. Not in my ears, but inside my head. Soft, insistent, calling my name. The passengers were no longer just shadows. They were forming, becoming solid, their empty eyes locking onto me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I understood now, or so I thought. The truth had been just beyond my grasp, an impossible puzzle piecing itself together too late. I had become part of it, part of them. The waiting ones, the lost ones. But I knew that soon someone else would take my place. And when they did, I would be waiting, just like the others had waited for me. But this time I waited with an intention. I would not be like them. I would not stand in silence watching as another soul was pulled into this endless cycle. I would fight against the whispers, against the road that had no end, against the thing that lurked in the spaces between moments. Perhaps I could not escape, but maybe, just maybe, I could warn the next driver. Break the illusion. Show them the truth before it was too late. I didn't know if it was possible. Maybe I was already too far gone. Maybe the whispers would smother my thoughts until I became just another shadow in the back of the bus. But as the road stretched endlessly before me, as the figures behind me stared with hollow patience, I clenched my fingers against the wheel. I would not fade, not yet. The next driver would come, and this time I would be ready. Two days later, I found myself in a deep forest. I didn't remember how I got there. The last thing I recalled was gripping the steering wheel, my mind swimming in whispers, the bus rolling through a world that wasn't supposed to exist. But now, I stood in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward a sky that pulsed with an unnatural twilight. And then I saw him. An old man sitting on a moss-covered log, smoking a pipe that gave off a thick, swirling smoke. He looked at me as if he had been expecting me. His eyes, dark, knowing, held a familiarity I couldn't place. "You finally made it," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke that twisted into strange shapes before dissolving into the air. I hesitated. "Do I know you?" He chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Not yet, but I know you." I took a cautious step closer. "Where am I?" "The place between," he said simply. "Where the road ends before it begins again." His words sent a shiver down my spine. Why is this happening to me? The old man tapped his pipe against the log, knocking out the embers. "It's not just you. It's all the ones who came before." He looked up, his expression grim. "The drivers." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He gestured for me to sit. I hesitated before lowering myself onto a nearby rock, the ground feeling strangely unstable beneath me. "This bus you've been driving..." He trailed off for a moment, as if deciding where to begin. "It's older than you realize, older than the roads themselves." I frowned. "How is that possible?" He sighed. "Decades ago, when this land was still wild, there was only one bus that dared to travel these paths. The roads were not like they are today. Just dirt and stone, barely passable. It was dangerous, but people had no choice. It was the only way." His voice grew quieter. "And so, the bus ran, over and over, through rain, through storms, through landslides and broken bridges, and with each journey the road claimed more lives." My breath hitched. Accidents? Too many to count. His eyes darkened. It became a thing of whispers, a ghost on the road. People feared it, but they needed it. Until one day, the worst happened. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What?" "The final journey," he murmured. "A storm, a cliffside road, a turn too sharp, and then nothing. The bus plunged into the abyss, taking every soul on board with it." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "But if it was destroyed, how?" "The bus was written off, buried in the wreckage, forgotten by the living." His gaze met mine. "But not by the dead." I exhaled shakily. "The passengers..." He nodded. "They never reached their destinations. Their journey was never completed, and so the bus remained." Not in the real world, but in the space between. A limbo for the lost. I clenched my fists. "And the drivers?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "The bus needs a driver." Always. I felt my throat tighten. So it chooses people? Not just anyone. He studied me. The ones who see it, the ones who hear the whispers, the ones who, for whatever reason, are already halfway into the in-between. A chill ran through me. What happens to them? The old man gave me a long, solemn look. Some resist. They try to escape, but the bus always finds them. He paused. Others accept it, and they drive. I felt dizzy. It all made sense now. The strange roads, the silent passengers, the feeling of losing myself. I ran a hand through my hair. Then how do I end this? How do I break the cycle? The old man exhaled. The passengers need to finish their journey. I stared at him. The only way to free them is to take them where they were meant to go, he continued. Their final destination. The words sent a strange sensation through me, something between fear and understanding. And if I do that? I asked hesitantly. His expression softened. Then you will no longer be the driver. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he began to fade. His body dissolved into mist, his form scattering like the smoke from his pipe. Wait! I reached out, but my fingers grasped only air. The forest around me blurred. The trees, the ground, the twilight sky, all of it twisted, dissolving into darkness, and then the hiss of the bus door closing. I was back, the driver's seat beneath me, the wheel in my hands, the dashboard lights glowing softly. Only this time, the bus was full. Row after row of passengers sat silently, their faces illuminated by the dim interior lights. But they were different now. No longer shadows, no longer empty. They were smiling. Something in my chest tightened. I exhaled and gripped the wheel. The engine rumbled. The headlights pierced the darkness. The road stretched ahead. Not the broken, twisting path of before, but something else, something peaceful. I pressed the pedal. As we moved one by one, the passengers began to fade, their forms dissolving into light, vanishing into the night, until only one remained. The old man. I turned to him. Who are you? He smiled, the sadness in his eyes unmistakable. I was the last driver of the vanishing bus, he said. And now you have freed us. His form flickered. Thank you, he whispered. And then he was gone. The bus rolled to a stop. The road ahead was empty. The seats behind me were bare. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the silence was just silence. I reached for the keys, expecting resistance, but this time they turned easily in my grasp. The engine died. The dashboard lights faded. I opened the door and stepped outside. A soft breeze touched my face. The air smelled of earth, of rain, of something real. I turned back. The bus was gone and I was free.